Hey everyone. I think this week is pretty straightforward on the boards. One of the biggest things, though, I've seen over the years, you're taking a primary source and a secondary source, and you're basically analyzing the sources, talking about how they work to kind of justify and build the topic that you want to pursue for the research proposal. One of the biggest things that I see is people use secondary sources as primary sources. And primary sources are going to be material that was written or produced otherwise at the time period in which you're studying. So if I'm studying World War One, and I want to look at World War One propaganda, a primary source would be, say, World War One propaganda posters. A journal article that writes about World War One propaganda posters would be a secondary source. Um, with media sources, sometimes it can get a little tricky. There are ways in which you could use a journal article as a primary source. Say I wanted to talk about how historians in the 1930s wrote about World War One propaganda. In that case, an article from the 1930s in a journal I would be using as a primary source. So there is some fluidity about that, to be sure, but just be careful that, again, the primary source you pick is a primary source. And if there's any kind of question about that, just talk about that briefly. It's like, why are you conceiving of this as a primary source and not a secondary source? Because, while it may be clear and it might be a very valid choice as a primary source, we don't always know how you're conceiving of things unless you say so, because obviously you've got a bigger picture of the project in your head than we would naturally have. So any details you can give that will help us see the sources through your eyes and how you're interpreting them, the better it will be. And it can help lead to some pretty good discussions as a result as well. For the assignment for this week, the first part, which please make sure you don't forget, even though it's not kind of enshrined in the rubric, is just to talk about where the project is right now. Again, it's kind of that journal aspect of just checking in, making sure that I know where you are, and if there's anything you're running into, that I'll know as well, and I can provide some feedback too. The other thing we're going to talk about is kind of this line I talked about with the intro video between academic history and more public history. Now, again, you may not see as stark a line as this implies. I tend to think of them as a lot more connected than they're often treated as I talked about before. But it's ultimately up to you and how you conceive the two and how you kind of conceive of the project you're building right now, whether it best fits in more of a how you see public history or versus academic history and the ways in which that can be flipped, or maybe in the ways in which it can be connected in the end. The final point there for bridging the gap between academic research history and public history, that again depends on the extent to which you see a huge gap in that, or if you maybe see more synergy than other people would between that. So that's ultimately, based on your interpretations of things. Make sure for the paper, use some of the resources for the week to give a sense as to what those two sides, whatever you want to call them, mean, at least within the field, or maybe some dissonance you see between how they should be understood versus how some may say they are understood. And that helps you kind of individualize and kind of build your own sense of self as a historian and presumably history enthusiast, given that you're in the program, to kind of individualize the work you're doing a bit too. So, all right, that's all I had for this week. We'll talk to everybody on the boards.